phenomenological philosophy, on the other hand, would maybe would begin to ask, try to get beneath that question of why is it that we, what is it about us that we ask questions at all, right? And one of the presuppositions, I guess, in constructivism that I'm hearing is that there's some pragmatic goal, that it's an end, it's a tool, right? That knowledge is a tool. The knowledge is something that we use to produce certain ends, right? And so we'd want to maybe go from a phenomenological philosophy, kind of maybe even bracket that, saying like, well, does all insight have to be pragmatic, for example? Could there be a non-pragmatic sort of insight, right? And try to cut beneath that. Is knowledge best understood through the metaphor of a tool? Might there be, how does that fit, and what leads us in some original way to even begin to ask how we come to knowledge?
See, I mean,
right?
in some ways, that's one of the things that people get at times uncomfortable with about constructivism, because people want the idea that knowledge is knowledge for knowledge's sake, it's somehow pure. And I think constructivists often will approach things from the idea of why are we doing this? What is the purpose of it? That is, nobody's ever doing something purely from just knowledge for knowledge's sake kind of thing. There's always kind of agendas and ways of understanding that, and strategies and goals and reasons why we're doing things. We're always coming at things from a frame. So it's, but somehow people think that, well, if you think about knowledge in this more pragmatic way, that you devalue truth, because then anything goes. Whatever practical thing you come up with to serve your ends, people will say, oh, it's just a form of instrumentalism, and that's terrible, and that's unethical, and you devalue truth, and you don't really believe in there being any kind of ultimate knowledge. And once you go in that direction, everything's going to fall down and go to hell. Although, as far as I know, constructivists, there are a lot of reasons the world may be going to hell, but constructivists thinking about knowledge in this more pragmatic way, I'm not sure is one of them.
Well, I think, let me say, first of all, that I think the phenomenological tradition would share the idea that a pure understanding of truth isn't the only way of coming to understanding truth. I mean, in the sense that, but I think maybe where there would be some differences, it would say that our way of understanding truth in our modern age, or our postmodern age, in this pragmatic way, is something that could be also provisional, right? And that and I think when you get into later Heidegger, he talks about our current age as a technological age, as a way of, but technology not as technological things, but as a particular way of understanding, which I think you've described as pragmatism, which is that it's a way of understanding that tends to see things in terms of sort of standing reserve, things that are available for our use to produce certain ends, and that we and that knowledge is in the service of human beings. Heidegger pointed out that that's radically different, say, than the context within which science originally emerged, say, within medieval Christianity, where science was originally not in the service, was in the service of trying to understand God, right, or truth in some ultimate transcendent sense, where we understood ourselves as finite beings, and ultimate truth in some sense as inaccessible in any total way, right? So, it's in the medieval age, the way we understand what truth means is very different than in the modern age, and then we go back to the Greeks, and truth has a entirely different meaning, and so on. So Heideggers like to go back and try to examine different ages. Now Heidegger seemed to have a bias that the Greeks somehow got it right, and we've just screwed it up ever since in some way. And I think that in a way is his own sort of cultural bias. So who are we in a sense to? So maybe we'd want to even bracket in a radical phenomenological way what we even mean by truth.
Right.
Yeah.
But you can see why traditional empirical psychologists look at phenomenology and they say, well, this makes no sense, because you're essentially using a method where you are the tool, you are the barometer by which you measure what's true, and so there's no way to kind of refute you, because you sort of report your experience, and so I guess somebody else could do their own phenomenological research and say, "Oh, I'm coming to a different conclusion." But there's no, I'm curious about how you respond to sort of traditional empirical psychologists.
Right.
I mean, I have.
Well, we're going up to another level. Remember, I was talking about phenomenological philosophy.
Right.
So now we're going back up to psychology. And I think it's important to make that distinction.
So when we think about psychology,
phenomenological philosophy questions in this very radical way, the very roots, and it's always taking a step back and questioning. But in order to do science, you can't do that. It's like Thomas Kuhn said, that progress in science is dependent upon certain times where we just stop asking those questions and begin to sort of try to build sort of body of thought and make sense of things in some ways. But there are revolutions in science where there's a radical questioning of those basic foundations, and it restructures the entire field of knowledge. And I don't know. I've written a paper on this, and I don't even know if I agree with that paper anymore. Because there's something about this assumption that there's always a revolution and then normal science that seems, and that there's incommensurability between these different paradigms. It just seems pointless to do any science, and that doesn't seem to fit with my sense that there's some sense of accumulation of wisdom that can happen in inquiry. But at the same time, there's also these Gestalt switches, totally new ways of understanding things, within which all of our past understanding is understood in a completely new way. But I don't think maybe it's not cumulative, but it's not completely, it's not a radical discarding of an entire previous tradition either. But that's another question. But the point is, that we can't, when we're doing science, we can't always ask these more fundamental questions.
I've talked to people who are traditional experimental psychologists.
Right.
And when I've mentioned to them phenomenological psychology and phenomenological approaches to scientific investigation, they say, that's not science.
Right. Well,
it's not science. It's basically, people saying that they're doing this sort of phenomenological reduction where they're the barometer.
Right.
And that's not science. That's just subjectivity.
Well, I didn't finish my question. I mean, answering your question. Because I was just saying
I'm not saying I agree with that.
Right.
But that's the argument I've heard
people
offer.
Yeah. What I'm saying is we have to, in order to answer that question, though, I'm saying that phenomenological psychology, in a sense, is not asking those fundamental questions. It's asking what is the meaning of this phenomenon in a psychological way. And so when you're doing that, you're not just using, and at least if you use like Amadeo Giorgi, Connie Fisher, Bill Fisher, that was developed at Duquesne, the Duquesne School, for example, that approach to phenomenological research, phenomenological psychology, I think isn't just using the researcher as a barometer.
Okay.
You're using data from interviews, or scripts of some kind from actual people.
But you're interpreting them.
Absolutely.